The words tore out of her before she could stop them. I can't let her go back to him. I won't. 3:22 in the morning. The diner booth felt like a confessional, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like dying insects, the smell of burnt coffee and grease thick in the air, coating everything. Snow hammered against the glass so hard it sounded like gravel, like someone was throwing handfuls of broken ice at the windows. The blizzard had sealed off San Francisco street by street, turning the world outside into a white void where nothing moved and nothing survived. Across from her sat the man whose blood still stained her hands. Aleandro Bianchi. 6'2", broad-shouldered, his expensive black suit torn at the shoulder seam and bloodstained across the left side where the fire had caught him. A fresh white bandage wrapped around his left forearm, the gauze already seeping pink at the edges. His dark eyes, storm gray in this fluorescent light, hadn't moved from her face since she'd said the girl's name. Emma. He'd gone absolutely still. Not the stillness of a man at rest, but the stillness of a predator that has caught a scent it has been hunting for 5,000 nights. Say her name again, he said. His voice was deep and solid like an oath, like something carved into stone that would never move. Aria's hands trembled on the coffee cup she wasn't drinking. The cup had arrived 10 minutes ago, untouched, because her throat had forgotten how to swallow. She was 29 years old but looked 40, her dark hair pulled back so tight it gave her a permanent expression of shock, her brown eyes hollow from 3 years of sleeping for hours a night. She wore the same black dress she'd worn yesterday and the day before that, a maid's uniform for a household that would never acknowledge her as anything but the help. The collar was frayed. The hem was coming loose. She had $34 in her coat pocket. 34. It was folded in her wallet like it was made of gold, because $34 meant she could eat for 8 more days if she rationed correctly. Emma, she whispered. Something flickered in his eyes. Not emotion, something older than emotion. Something that lived in the spaces beneath civilization where the real machinery of the world still turned. You know where she is, he said. Not a question. Yes. And you pulled me from that car. Aria's fingers found the worn prayer card in her coat pocket, the one with the Virgin Mary that her mother had carried until the day she disappeared. She held onto it like it could stop the shaking. I didn't know who you were, she said. I still don't, not really. But a man doesn't deserve to burn. The lieutenant on his right, Marco, tall and built like a constructed wall, his suit probably cost $8,000, shifted his weight. He'd been watching Aria like she was a bomb that might detonate. In the 3 hours since the paramedics had cleared Aleandro, in the time she'd sat across from this man in this fluorescent diner, Marco had not looked away once. 3 years, Aleandro said quietly. You have been in that house for 3 years. Yes. And you did not tell anyone. I couldn't. The Ashfords, Victoria especially, she watches everything. Everyone. The moment she found out I knew, she would have destroyed me. And I wouldn't have cared, not for myself, but I couldn't let them take Emma. She's only 6 years old and she still has light in her eyes and I wasn't going to be the person who let it get extinguished. His jaw tightened. A muscle moved beneath the skin like something alive trying to escape. What did they tell her about her father? He asked. That you were dead. That you had been killed in an accident when she was a baby. They showed her a photograph of a man she'd never met and told her his name and told her to never speak it aloud, not to anyone. Not even to herself. She's forgotten you completely. She barely remembers that there was ever a man in her story at all. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight, that takes up space, that makes it hard to breathe. Outside, the wind howled. It sounded like something with teeth. I need to rewind this, Aria said suddenly, her voice breaking. You need to understand how I ended up in that house, how I ended up on that street at 11:47 at night walking through a blizzard with $34 to my name. You need to know who I am before you decide what happens next. Aleandro's dark eye studied her like she was a text written in a language he was learning. Then tell me. The coffee maker at Henderson's diner had been broken for 42 days. Aria knew this because she'd been counting. She counted everything, every penny, every minute of overtime, every dollar that stood between her and the street. 42 days meant the coffee was rebrewed 3, sometimes 4 times in a single shift, the water heated and poured over the same grounds until it tasted like dirty dishwater and broken dreams. This was fine. Aria didn't drink coffee anymore. She couldn't afford to. Coffee cost money, and money was a substance that moved through her life like water through a sieve. As soon as it arrived, it vanished. The diner smelled like grease, like decades of cooking oil that had seeped into the walls and the floor and the furniture until the building itself had become a monument to fried food and desperation. The red vinyl booths were cracked in places, the cracks filled with something that might have been dirt or might have been the residue of 1,000 desperate people eating meals they couldn't pay for. Aria knew about desperate. She was 26 years old and desperate was her native language. The clock on the wall read 11:44 p.m. 13 minutes until her shift ended. 13 minutes until she could take off the apron that had more stains than fabric and walk back to the Ashford estate, to the converted closet that Mrs. Victoria Ashford allowed her to sleep in, where the window didn't close properly and the radiator banged like it was full of angry ghosts. A man came in through the front door and brought the November wind with him. He was built wide across the shoulders, the kind of man who had to turn sideways to fit through doorways. His suit probably cost more than everything she'd ever owned, charcoal grey wool that hung like it had been painted onto his skin. His hair was dark, slicked back, with just the first threads of silver at the temples. He was older than her, maybe 45, maybe 50, and his face had the kind of structure that looked carved from granite. A scar ran from the outside corner of his left eye down to his cheekbone, thin and pale, the kind of scar that told stories about violence. He sat in the corner booth. The one where she always got the order wrong because the light was broken there. "Coffee," he said. His voice was quiet. "Black. No sugar." She poured it from the reheated pot, watching the dark liquid stream into the cup. "Anything else?" "No." She placed the cup in front of him and turned to leave, but something made her pause. "Are you okay?" she asked. He looked up at her with those storm-grey eyes and she understood immediately that she'd made a mistake. This was not a man who answered personal questions. This was not a man who explained himself. "I'm fine," he said quietly. But he wasn't fine. She could see it in the way his hands were clenched around the cup, in the tension in his shoulders, in the way his eyes kept moving toward the window like he was waiting for something to arrive. Aria turned away and went back to refilling napkin dispensers that didn't need refilling. The minutes crawled by like they were injured. Then the door chimed again. A woman came in. She was dressed in a coat that probably cost $2,000, the kind of coat that didn't come from stores but from designers in cities Aria would never visit. She was tall, elegant, maybe 60 years old but aging into that space where rich women looked timeless because they had the money to buy time itself. Victoria Ashford. Aria's heart tried to relocate itself to her stomach. "I thought I'd find you here," Victoria said, and she was looking at the man in the corner booth. "The police found the Mercedes on Cabrillo Street. They're still trying to get the door open, but they know it was you. The whole city knows it was you." The man with the scar didn't respond. Victoria sat down across from him anyway. She removed her gloves slowly, methodically, each finger a ritual. "Did you get the answer you were looking for, Aleandro? Did you find what you were hunting for?" "Not yet," he said quietly. "Well then. We should discuss what happens next. Because Douglas is getting nervous. He doesn't like loose ends, and right now, loose ends are what you are. A man with too much power asking too many questions in the wrong places, and my partner is starting to think you're more trouble than you're worth." Aria had stopped moving. She had become a piece of furniture, a statue in a black dress, because if Victoria saw her, if she registered her presence as anything more than air, then later there would be questions. There were always questions. "I'm not going anywhere," Aleandro said, and his voice had changed. It was still quiet, but underneath the quiet was something sharp, like a blade wrapped in ice. Victoria smiled. "That's what I was afraid of." She stood up, replaced her gloves carefully, and left. The door chimed as she exited into the November night. Aria realized she'd been holding her breath. When she looked back at the booth, Aleandro was still there, and he was staring directly at her. Directly. Like he'd known the whole time that she was listening. Like he'd known that she'd heard Victoria say Douglas and partner and loose ends. She'd heard everything. The shift ended. Aria took off her apron, clocked out $7.50 tip money, which meant she now had $41.50 to last until the next shift, and stepped out into the November night. The blizzard had arrived in the hours since the man with the scar had come to the diner. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to maybe 10 feet, maybe less. The streets were empty. This part of San Francisco, the older neighborhoods, became a wasteland after dark. No one came here unless they lived here or they were lost. Aria lived here, in the sense that she had a place to sleep, though whether a converted closet in someone else's house counted as living was a question she'd stopped asking. She walked with her hands in her coat pockets, her $41.50 tucked into her wallet like it was made of spun glass. The wind came at her like something with teeth. 2 blocks from the diner, the world exploded. The sound came first, a concussion that hit her chest and knocked the air out of her lungs. She stumbled, turned, and saw it 2 blocks north, a black Mercedes wrapped around a telephone pole, flames already crawling up the engine block, licking across the hood like something hungry and alive. Aria didn't think. Thinking was a luxury. She ran. The snow was knee-deep and the wind kept trying to push her sideways, but she moved through it like someone possessed. The car was a furnace when she reached it, the heat radiating off the metal in waves. The windshield had shattered. The driver's side door was twisted and stuck. She grabbed the handle with both hands and pulled. Nothing. Pulled again. Her fingers were already burning from the heat. Help, she screamed, but there was no one. There was never anyone. She wedged her fingers into the gap between the door and the frame and pulled with everything she had. The door shrieked open. Inside the car, slumped against the steering wheel, was the man with the scar. Blood ran down his left side. His suit was soaked with it. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow, like something guttering. Aria reached in and grabbed his shoulders. He was heavy, dead weight, the weight of a man who was already halfway to another world. She pulled him toward her, dragging him across the center console, pulling him out of the car with strength she didn't know she possessed. His arms caught on something and she twisted, freed him, kept pulling. 20 feet from the car. She had pulled him 20 feet through knee-deep snow when the back seat erupted in flames. They fell together in the snow, his blood hot against her hands, his weight collapsing against her, his face suddenly a hand's breadth from hers. "Stay with me," she whispered, though she didn't know who she was talking to. "Stay with me. Don't you dare die in this snow." Behind them, the Mercedes became a funeral pyre. And in that moment, with the fire lighting up the blizzard, with this stranger's blood on her skin, with $41.50 in her coat pocket and everything to lose and nothing to protect except her own desperate determination not to let one more thing die in this city, Aria Sinclair understood that her life had just pivoted on an axis she couldn't see. But what she did not know was that the man whose blood stained her hands had been searching for 5 years. That he had lost everything that mattered. That he had been hunting through San Francisco for a girl with her father's eyes, and she, this ordinary woman pulling a stranger from a burning car, was the only person alive who knew where to find her. The paramedics would arrive in 4 minutes. By then, everything had already changed. The clock on the bedroom wall read 5:03 a.m. Aria Sinclair opened her eyes in darkness so complete it felt like being buried alive. Her alarm had not gone off. She never needed it. Her body had learned to wake before dawn the way a hunted animal learns to wake before predators. She lay still for 3 seconds, listening to the house breathe around her, then pushed herself up. The bedroom was 6 feet by 8 feet. A converted closet, Victoria Ashford had called it during the interview, saying the word converted as though she had granted Aria a gift instead of a storage space. A twin mattress lay directly on the floor. No frame. No box spring. No headboard. The mattress was white once. Now it was the color of old bones. One wire hanger hung from a nail in the wall, and on that hanger hung her 2 work uniforms, both black, both pressed so carefully the creases could have cut glass. A lamp she had bought at a thrift store for $3 sat on the floor beside the mattress. The lampshade was missing. She had never replaced it. She pushed back the thin blanket and felt the cold find her immediately. The room had one small window, high up near the ceiling, and it looked out directly into the brick wall of the building next door. No light came through it. No air moved. The only ventilation was when she propped open the bedroom door, and Victoria had been explicit about that. The door stayed closed during the day so guests would not see her room. Aria stood and her knees made small sounds of complaint. 28 years old. Sometimes when she caught her reflection in the kitchen window, she did not recognize the woman looking back. The face was hers, but it had been hollowed out from the inside. Dark hair pulled back so tightly it gave her headaches. Eyes that had forgotten how to look surprised. Hands with calluses thick as leather. She opened the small cardboard box beneath the window. Inside was her money. $34. 23 singles, for 5s, 2 quarters. She had counted it 3 times yesterday and 3 times the day before. The amount never changed because she had nowhere to spend money. Food came from the Ashford house. Her uniforms were provided. She received no paycheck. Instead, Victoria paid the collection agency directly. $400 monthly went to them. That was the arrangement they had made 6 months ago when the collection calls had become so constant that Victoria threatened to fire her. The medical debt was $85,000. She had done the mathematics. At $400 per month, it would take her 17 years and 4 months to repay it. She was already 28. Aria returned the cardboard box to its place and dressed in one of her uniforms. Black dress. White collar. Sensible shoes. She pulled her hair back so tightly her temples throbbed. In the mirror above the sink, a small mirror, 6 inches square, installed at shoulder height so she had to bend to see herself, she examined her face for any sign that she had slept at all. She had not. Sleep had become an unreliable thing, a luxury that cost too much. At 5:11 a.m., she climbed the narrow servant staircase that connected her room to the main house. The Ashford mansion sprawled across Pacific Heights like a monument to old money. 3 stories. 12 bedrooms. A kitchen the size of Aria's entire apartment had been before she lost it. She pushed through the service door and the smell of yesterday's meals hit her immediately: butter, roasted chicken, wine gone sour in abandoned glasses. The kitchen was dark. The house was still asleep. She moved through it like a ghost. Like a person who had learned not to take up space. She switched on the kitchen lights, a cascade of fluorescent brightness that made her blink, and began the work that filled her days. She filled the espresso machine with grounds. She arranged pastries on a plate, pastries she would not eat, that cost more than she earned in a day. She set the table in the dining room with napkins pressed into perfect triangles. Silverware placed with precision. Water glasses filled so the water caught the light. At 6:28 a.m., the children began to arrive. Thomas was 9 years old, demanding, with his mother's sharp mouth and his father's arrogance. He threw his backpack on the floor and did not pick it up. Eleanor was 7, quiet in the way that meant she was watching everything, storing it up. But it was the youngest, the one who had made Aria's life something other than merely surviving, who appeared last. Emma Ashford was 6 years old. She had dark curls and a pale face and eyes that seemed to look through most people as if they weren't quite real. But when she saw Aria, something shifted in her expression. Not a smile. Emma did not smile. But something like recognition. She went directly to the table and sat down. She waited. Aria brought her breakfast. Eggs, toast, fresh berries. Emma did not touch the food. She reached into the pocket of her school uniform and withdrew something small and worn. A prayer card. The edges were frayed. The image on the front was so faded it had become almost abstract, a saint, maybe, or just the ghost of a saint. Saint Anthony. Saint Catherine. Saint someone who could not help. Emma held the card so tightly her knuckles went white. "That is very special," Aria said, and she sat down beside her, something she was not supposed to do during mealtimes. She had learned not to follow every rule. Some rules existed to break. "Where did you get it?" Emma's mouth moved silently. Words that did not come out. Victoria's voice came from somewhere deeper in the house, sharp as a blade. "The children need to eat, Aria. Not converse." Aria stood immediately. She smoothed the front of her uniform. She had learned exactly how Victoria's voice worked, which tone meant inconvenience, which meant the threshold of firing, which meant she should disappear for the next 8 hours. This was the dismissal tone. She withdrew to the kitchen and stayed there until the children left for school. She cleaned the dishes they had barely touched. She wiped down the counters. She prepared Victoria's lunch, poached chicken, a salad, sparkling water with ice. She brought it to the sitting room at noon and found Victoria on the phone, wearing a silk robe the color of champagne, her nails painted a red so dark it looked like dried blood. Victoria did not acknowledge her. Aria set the plate down and was turning to leave when she heard it. A single word spoken into the phone. A name. "Douglas will be here Thursday night. Make sure the wines are properly chilled." Aria froze for less than a second, the smallest hesitation, then continued out of the room. But that half-second of stillness had cost her. Everything about the Ashford house was designed to notice things like that. To measure the exact temperature of servants' attention. And somewhere in the basement of the house, in a locked filing cabinet in a room Victoria thought no one knew about, there was a folder with Douglas Hale's name on the spine. In that folder were photographs. Ledgers. Payment schedules written in Victoria's immaculate handwriting. The full accounting of women who had disappeared from the city, one by one, with Victoria's connection smoothing the way, her charity galas providing cover, her name opening doors that led to other doors that led to places no light reached. But Aria did not know any of that yet. What she did know was that her one day off was in 17 days. That on her one day off, she would go to St. Catherine's shelter on Mission Street. That she would find Emma sitting in the corner of the recreation room, holding her prayer card, and she would sit beside her in the silence and promise her that something better existed somewhere in the world. Emma was not the Ashford's child at all. The adoption had been finalized quietly, paperwork smoothed through channels that cost money and asked no questions. And the paperwork did not say where she came from. The paperwork did not say that her mother had been pulled into the same network of disappearance that had consumed so many others. The paperwork did not say that Emma had been found in a foster home 3 months ago, traumatized beyond language, still clutching the prayer card her mother had pressed into her hand the night she was taken. What connected them was invisible. A thread so thin it could not be seen in daylight. A secret that lived in Emma's silence, in the way she held Aria's hand, in the way she chose to appear at the shelter every month on the exact day Aria was permitted to volunteer there. 22 days later, at 3:22 in the morning, Aria sat across from Aleandro Bianchi in a fluorescent-lit diner while the blizzard hammered against the windows. Snow fell so heavily it had sealed off the entire city. The streets outside were white. The traffic lights swung in the wind like hanged things. She did not know his name yet. He sat with his arm pressed against his side where the bandage leaked. His suit was ruined. His face was the color of old paper. But his eyes, when they fixed on hers, held something that made her understand she was not sitting across from an ordinary man. "Tell me about the girl," he said. His voice was rough from pain, fractured, but also something else. Something that sounded like he was holding back from screaming. "Tell me everything you know about the girl in the shelter." And Aria understood, in that moment, that the car crash had not been an accident at all. The wind screamed through the streets of San Francisco like something alive and wounded. Snow fell so thick that the world narrowed to 10 feet of visibility, then 5, then nothing but white and cold and the sound of her own breathing. Aria Sinclair had been walking for 40 minutes when she heard it, the explosion. It came from 2 blocks away, a sound like the sky tearing open, followed by the high shriek of metal screaming as it twisted. Car alarms wailed in the distance. Then silence returned, heavy and wrong. The kind of silence that meant something irreversible had just happened. She shouldn't have investigated. Every rational thought in her frozen mind screamed at her to keep walking toward the shelter, to find that cot in the volunteer room, to survive another night the way she had survived every other night for the past 3 years. But her feet changed direction anyway. The Mercedes was embedded nose first into a telephone pole, the driver's side crumpled like paper, and the flames were spreading fast. Orange light flickered across the pristine snow, painting everything the color of hell. The rear driver's side door hung partially open, and Aria could see a shape slumped in the front seat, utterly still. She moved without thinking. Her frozen fingers found the edge of the driver's side door. It wouldn't budge. The metal was already hot, burning her palms even through the thin fabric of her coat, which she'd bought at a thrift store years ago for $12. She wrenched harder, feeling something pull in her shoulder, and the door shrieked open an inch, then another. The man inside was unconscious, his expensive suit soaked dark with blood from a gash across his temple. Glass glittered across his white shirt. His face was turned sideways against the steering wheel, his features arranged in the slack expression of someone completely unreachable. Aria reached across the console and grabbed him under the arms. His suit jacket felt like cashmere. Everything about him screamed money, power, the kind of man who never experienced cold or hunger or desperation. His body was solid, muscular, heavier than she expected. She pulled with everything she had, feeling her spine bend and her legs strain, and inch by inch she dragged him through the space between the seat and the door frame. The flames were spreading. She could smell the gasoline now, acrid and chemical. The heat intensified, and she felt her hair singeing along the left side of her face, a smell like burned plastic. 20 feet. That was how far she managed to pull him before the car exploded. The blast came without warning. Fire erupted outward in a perfect sphere of orange and black, and the shock wave hit her from behind, lifting her bodily and throwing her forward onto the ice. She fell hard, the man's weight pinning her down, pain flaring bright in her ribs where his shoulder connected with her body. She lay there gasping, watching the Mercedes burn, watching the flames consume the place where they had been seconds before. The man groaned. Blood poured from a gash on his arm where glass had shredded the skin from elbow to wrist, and she moved on instinct, yanking the wool scarf from her own neck, the scarf she'd bought for $3 because it was the only thing in the thrift store that could keep her warm in winter, and pressing it against the wound. Her frozen fingers fumbled in her coat pocket for her phone. She had to call 911. That was the only rational response to a dying man bleeding into the snow. She was dialing when his eyes opened. They were dark. Not brown, but the kind of darkness that existed in deep water where no light reached. When those eyes focused on her face, Aria felt something primitive in her brain recognize danger. Pure danger, the kind that existed independent of circumstances or context. The kind that had nothing to do with the crash or the fire. He grabbed her wrist. His grip was shocking, the strength of someone who had been trained not to scream, not to show weakness, not to let pain change his face. She tried to pull away, but he held her there with casual effortlessly. "No," he said. One word. His voice was rough from pain, fractured, but underneath it ran something solid like an oath. "You're bleeding," she said. "No ambulance. No police." He pulled his phone from his jacket with his free hand, still held the phone despite being shot and slashed and hit by an explosion, and made one call. 2 words, Marco. Now. Aria should have run. Every survival instinct screamed at her to wrench her wrist free and disappear into the blizzard and never look back at this man and his darkness and his impossible control. But he was bleeding out in the snow and she couldn't leave him. The black SUVs arrived in 6 minutes. They came from the white storm like predators emerging from fog, 2 vehicles, engines cutting off in perfect synchronization. Men in dark suits emerged, moving with the precision of a military unit. Marco was the first one to reach them. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow like a blade cut across his face. When he saw the man in the snow, something shifted in his expression, not surprise, exactly, but a recognition of gravity, of stakes shifting, of worlds rearranging themselves. "Boss," Marco said, and his voice carried the weight of a report from a general to his commander. "Aleandro." That was how she learned his name. Marco said it without using the word, just in the way his entire body changed, becoming deferential, careful, respectful in the way soldiers are respectful to men who command armies. He lifted Aleandro with ease, cradling him like he weighed nothing, and Gino, stockier, with silver threading his dark hair, turned to her. "You need to come with us." Not a question. The interior of the SUV smelled like leather and expensive cologne. Aria sat pressed against the window, her coat still bloody, her scarf tied around Aleandro's arm, watching the blizzard through tinted windows while Marco sat beside him performing field surgery with the competence of someone who had done this many times before. No anesthetic. No complaints. Aleandro's face remained a stone mask, but Aria watched a single drop of blood fall from his jaw to his white shirt, and she understood that pain lived inside him, just locked behind a door he had learned long ago how to close. The diner was empty except for a single waitress who took one look at Aleandro and vanished into the kitchen without taking any orders. The checkered floor was black and white, and the neon open sign in the window flickered in the way that things flicker when they are slowly dying. It was 3:22 in the morning. The clock on the wall said so. Aria wrapped her hands around a mug of black coffee that she couldn't afford and probably shouldn't accept, but the woman who brought it had such pity in her eyes that Aria took it anyway. Steam rose in delicate spirals. Aleandro sat across from her with his arm field-dressed and his suit ruined and his face the color of old paper, and he looked at her like she was the most confusing thing he had encountered in his life. "Why did you pull me from the fire?" he asked. "I don't know," she said, and it was true. "You were dying." "That's not a reason." "Maybe not. But it was enough." He studied her for a moment that stretched like an hour. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the diner's windows, pressing snow against the glass like the world was trying to get in. "What's your name?" he said. "Aria Sinclair." "What do you do, Aria Sinclair?" And she told him. About the Ashford family, the converted closet room that measured 6 feet by 4 feet, about Victoria's voice like a whip, about the 14-hour days that started at 6 in the morning and didn't end until after the children were sleeping. About the 14-hour days every day, 6 days a week, and how her day off was spent volunteering at the shelter because that was the only place she felt like a human being instead of a machine that existed to serve. She told him about the $85,000 in medical debt crushing her like a stone, debt that would never disappear, debt that her great-great-grandchildren would inherit if this world followed the laws of justice. And he listened without interrupting, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he said something that made Marco freeze mid-sip of coffee. "You're not going back there." Aria laughed. It came out like breaking glass. "Why would you help me? I'm nobody. You don't even know me. You're bleeding and you should be in a hospital and instead you're sitting in a diner with a woman you met 30 minutes ago." Aleandro set down his own untouched coffee. His hand was steady, which seemed impossible. "I'm looking for someone," he said. "A child. My daughter. She was taken from me 5 years ago." His voice cracked on the word daughter. Just slightly. Just enough that Aria understood this wasn't a casual statement. "She would be 6 now," he continued. "Dark curls. Brown eyes. Doesn't speak." Aria's mug hit the table. The coffee sloshed but didn't spill. In her coat pocket was a worn prayer card, faded and creased, with an image of Saint Anthony on one side. Emma had dropped it last month during her volunteer shift, and Aria had kept it, meaning to return it, never quite finding the right moment. She pulled it out with trembling fingers and set it on the table between them. Aleandro picked it up. His hand shook visibly. On the back of the card, in handwriting that had become familiar to Aria over the past month, was a name, Emma Bianchi. Below that, may you always find your way home. His composure, whatever had been holding it together, shattered. Not in a dramatic way. There was no sound, no movement, just the way his shoulders curved inward and the way tears appeared on his face as if summoned by some ancient god of sorrow. Marco looked away, giving him privacy. Gino stared at his coffee. In 15 years neither of them had ever seen this. "Tell me everything," Aleandro said. "Tell me everything you know." And Aria told him about Emma at the shelter, about the way she didn't speak but would sit next to Aria and hold her hand. About the prayer card she'd brought from somewhere, clutched in her small fist. About her mother vanishing. About trauma so deep it had locked the words inside her. Aleandro told her about his brother, Dante Bianchi, who sold out the family empire to a rival organization. Who kidnapped Emma in the chaos, who handed her to someone in a trafficking network to make her disappear forever. He had to choose between mercy and survival. He chose survival. Dante died screaming. But Emma was already gone. Until now, Aleandro said. Now she's found. The diner's door opened. A man entered, tall and thin, wearing a camel coat that probably cost more than Aria's entire yearly salary. His smile looked like a shark's. 2 men in dark suits followed him inside. Aria's stomach dropped. She recognized him. Douglas Hale. He'd been at the Ashford mansion twice in the past month, meeting privately with Victoria in the study with the door closed and the curtains drawn. The way he'd looked at her made her skin crawl, the way a predator's gaze crawls across prey. Douglas ordered black coffee without looking at anyone. Then he looked directly at Aria. Everything clicked into place like a lock opening. Aleandro's hand moved toward his gun. She felt the atmosphere at the table shift, become dangerous, become a threat. He just made a mistake, Aleandro said quietly. But what Aleandro didn't know was that Douglas Hale had already marked Aria for collection. What he didn't know was that Victoria Ashford had already accepted payment for her name, her address, her vulnerabilities. What he didn't know was that the clock was already running. The hunter and the hunted had just locked eyes in a fluorescent diner at 3:35 in the morning, and everything was about to change. At 3:35 in the morning, the fluorescent light of the diner hummed like dying electricity, and the door opened with a sound like a gunshot in the silence. Aria's entire body went rigid. The man who entered wore a camel coat that cost more than every paycheck she'd ever earned stacked together, and his smile looked like a shark's when it tastes blood in the water. Douglas Hale. She'd seen him twice at the Ashford mansion, meeting with Victoria behind closed doors, the way his eyes had crawled across her skin like something predatory and patient. 2 men in dark suits flanked him. One had a scar running from his eye to his cheekbone. The other carried himself like violence lived in his bones. Douglas ordered black coffee without looking at anyone. Then his gaze found Aria across the diner, and the world stopped moving. Aleandro's hand moved toward his gun so slowly it was almost invisible. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Marco and Gino, positioned near the kitchen, went absolutely still. The waitress behind the counter froze mid-pour. He just made a mistake, Aleandro said quietly. His voice sounded like venom wrapped in velvet. What Aria didn't know, sitting in that booth with snow hammering against the windows, was that Douglas Hale had already marked her for collection. That Victoria Ashford had already accepted payment for her name, her address, her vulnerabilities. That the clock was already running, ticking down toward something none of them could stop. The hunter and the hunted had locked eyes. Everything was about to change. 6 hours earlier, at 6:56 in the morning, Aleandro had taken Aria to Emma. The shelter was quiet, blessed with the kind of silence that only exists in those hours between night and dawn, when the city sleeps and the world feels like it might start over. Marco and Gino secured the perimeter outside while Aleandro and Aria walked through the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through. Emma was in the common room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her crayons spread in front of her like she'd been waiting. Colors for sad days, Sister Mary said Emma called them. Purples and blacks and grays, all arranged in careful rows. When the door opened, Emma looked up. Her eyes, so old in a 6-year-old face, found Aleandro first. She went completely still, like an animal recognizing a scent it had known in another lifetime. Aleandro knelt 10 feet away. He didn't approach. He just whispered 2 words in Italian, "Piccola Stella," and Emma's entire body convulsed. She screamed, a sound like an animal finding its mother again after an impossible darkness, and she ran into his arms so fast her crayons scattered everywhere. He held her. This man the underworld whispered about in terror, this man who commanded armies, held his daughter and sobbed into her hair while she clung to him with both arms, repeating his name over and over like a prayer, like a song, like the only word that mattered in the entire world. Sister Mary turned away, tears running down her face. Marco stood in the doorway, and something in his expression shifted. In 15 years of working for Aleandro Bianchi, Marco had never seen him break. Had never seen him cry. Had never seen him hold anything gentle like it was sacred. "I have you," Aleandro whispered into Emma's hair. "I have you. I have you. You are safe. Papa has you." Emma's small fingers tangled in his suit jacket. "I knew you would come. I knew you would find me. Sister Mary said you were looking. I knew. 5 years of searching. 5 years of chasing ghosts through the underworld, following trails that led nowhere, turning the city inside out looking for a child who might already be gone. 5 years. Ended. But time was already running out. At noon that same day, Aria returned to the Ashford mansion to collect her belongings. The foyer was exactly as she remembered it, marble and mirrors and the kind of cold that money creates, the kind that no amount of warmth can ever touch. Her converted closet room on the 3rd floor was waiting, filled with the few things she owned in the world. Douglas Hale stood in the foyer with Victoria. He wasn't wearing his camel coat anymore. He was in a 3-piece suit, tailored, expensive, and his smile looked like a blade. "Miss Sinclair," he said. His voice was smooth, polished, the voice of a man who had never been told no in his life. "We had an appointment last night. You missed it." Victoria stood beside him, diamonds glittering at her throat and wrists, her expression cold as January. "Aria has reconsidered my offer." "Haven't you, dear?" $50,000 if you simply cooperate. Disappear for a week. We handle the rest." 2 of Hale's men blocked the door. Their eyes were empty. Douglas stepped close. Close enough that Aria could smell his cologne, something expensive that made her stomach turn. He reached out and touched her face, his fingers cold against her cheek. The contact felt like contamination. "You cost me a very lucrative evening," he said softly. "That has consequences." He held up a manila folder. Photographs spilled out. Aria at the shelter with Emma. Aria walking through the city at night. Aria entering the diner with Aleandro. There must have been 20 photos, maybe more, each one a violation, each one proving that Douglas Hale saw everything, that his reach extended everywhere. "You've made interesting friends," Douglas continued, sorting through the photographs like they were playing cards. "The Mafia boss. The child. Such touching devotion. But they can't protect you everywhere, Aria. Can they? And we still have the matter of the $85,000 debt. I could make that disappear. Vanish completely. All your problems gone. Or I could make you disappear. Your choice. You have 7 days." He closed the folder. His smile never wavered. "What will it be?" At 3:51 in the afternoon, Aria locked herself in her converted closet room. The space was barely large enough for a mattress and a single wooden chair. A bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting shadows that seemed to be closing in from all sides. The walls were so close she could touch them both at once if she stretched her arms out. This was where she had slept for 3 years. This was home. She spread $34 across the mattress. $34 in crumpled bills and loose change. That was everything. That was the entire distance between survival and the street. Victoria's voice echoed through the door, if you're not downstairs in 1 hour, I'm calling Douglas myself." Aria's hands shook so badly she couldn't hold the bills. They scattered across the mattress like leaves. She thought about running. Where would she run? She thought about calling the police. And saying what? That a rich woman and a trafficker wanted her to disappear? That she owed money to a man who sold human beings? No proof. No leverage. No power. The $85,000 debt would follow her forever. Douglas Hale would find her. Victoria would make sure of it. She was invisible. Disposable. Nobody. The footsteps in the hallway grew louder. 55 minutes had passed. Her hand reached toward the doorknob. 1 hour. That's all Victoria had said Douglas wanted. Just 1 hour in exchange for erasing the debt, for making the problem vanish, for being safe. 1 hour. Aria's fingers touched the cold metal. Then she saw it on the floor. The prayer card. The one Emma had held so tightly, the one the child had kept clutched in her small fist like it was the only real thing in a world that had been nothing but pain. Saint Anthony. Finder of lost things. She picked it up with trembling fingers. She pulled out her phone and called the number Aleandro had given her. He answered on the first ring. "Aria?" "He came," she whispered. "Douglas Hale. He came to the mansion. He has photographs. He's giving me 7 days." The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds. "Then, you are safe. That is over now. Do not leave that room. Do not go downstairs. I am coming." The line went dead. Aleandro struck at 8:11 in the evening. 12 men in black moved like ghosts through the Ashford mansion while 40 of San Francisco's wealthiest citizens sat at a charity dinner, sipping wine and discussing art and investment portfolios. They had no idea that the network beneath their feet had already been infiltrated, that every exit had been covered, that time had run out. Marco disabled security with a kind of precision that came from 15 years of practice. The cameras switched to a loop. The alarms went silent. Gino stationed men at every door. The guests continued eating. They didn't notice anything was wrong until Aleandro walked into the dining room. He wore a black suit that probably cost more than a year of Aria's old salary. His presence filled the room like pressure filling a space, like the air had become heavy and dangerous. He walked to Victoria Ashford's chair and stood behind her. The conversation died. Forks stopped mid-motion. "Mrs. Ashford," Aleandro said, his voice deep and solid like an oath. "We need to discuss your business arrangements." Victoria turned white. All the blood drained from her face like someone had opened a tap. 2 men in dark suits escorted her away from the table. She didn't resist. She was already broken, already understanding what was about to happen. Douglas Hale was in his penthouse at 8:51 in the evening, silk pajamas, a glass of wine, completely unaware that his life was ending. They came through his bedroom window on rappel lines, men moving like they were made of smoke and intention. He woke to the feeling of a gun barrel against his temple. "Hands where I can see them." They dragged him into his own living room in his silk pajamas, dignity evaporating, and Aleandro was waiting. Just standing there in the darkness, the city lights of San Francisco spread out behind him like he owned them. "You traffic in women and children," Aleandro said, his voice quiet, which made it worse somehow, made it more dangerous. "You marked someone under my protection. You showed her photographs. You gave her 7 days. Explain why I shouldn't kill you right now." Douglas collapsed to his knees. His entire body trembled like a cornered animal, like prey that finally understood it had been hunted all along. He begged. He offered money, names, locations, everything. He promised to disappear, to leave the country, to forget he'd ever heard of Aria Sinclair. Aleandro looked at him the way someone looks at something broken on the ground that was never meant to be fixed. "Death is too quick," he said. "Too easy. Too merciful." He made one phone call. Within 1 hour, every piece of evidence Douglas Hale had ever buried, financial records, victim testimony, photographs, names, was delivered to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the San Francisco Police Department, and 3 major news networks simultaneously. The FBI arrived at dawn. Douglas Hale was arrested in the same silk pajamas, federal charges piling up like bodies, 47 counts total, minimum 40 years in federal prison. His network collapsed by noon. The women he'd trafficked came forward. The men who'd worked for him disappeared into the machinery of justice. Everything he'd built dissolved like it had never existed. Victoria Ashford's downfall took only 40 minutes. Aleandro had invited 3 rival families to the charity dinner, men with long memories and longer grudges, men Victoria had betrayed in business dealings over the years. He laid out the proof, her involvement with Douglas Hale, her trafficking pipeline, her theft from her own charitable foundation that was supposed to help vulnerable women. She'd been stealing from them while selling them to traffickers. Then he left. 2 men in dark suits arrived at 9:16 in the evening and walked through the dining room full of 40 witnesses. They didn't announce who they were. They didn't need to. They simply said, "Mrs. Ashford, come with us." Victoria screamed. She stood up, threw her wine glass. She fought as they grabbed her arms, clawing at the carpet, clawing at the tablecloths, screaming Aleandro's name like it was a curse, like it was the last word she would ever speak. They dragged her out anyway. She vanished into the machinery of the underworld she'd thought herself untouchable within. No body was ever found. No one asked questions. Douglas Hale screamed her name from his cell for weeks, but no one came. The organization that Victoria had betrayed had no interest in mercy, and Aleandro had made sure they understood exactly what she'd done. Sometimes the underworld handled things the underworld way. Sometimes that was justice. And in the diner at 3:35 in the morning, as the snow fell and the city remained sealed in white silence, Aria and Aleandro sat across from each other, and she finally understood that she was safe. That Emma was safe. That the threat was over. Sometimes one hand reached out at the right moment can change an entire life. 3 weeks later, the city stretched below them like a promise, and Aria Sinclair stood in Aleandro Bianchi's office on the 42nd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows framing San Francisco in amber light and moving shadows. The nighttime skyline spread beneath her, 1,000 windows glowing like stars brought down to earth, and somewhere far below, the streets where she used to count coins in the dark felt like a different lifetime entirely. Aleandro sat behind a desk of polished mahogany, the kind of furniture that cost more than her annual salary used to be. He opened a drawer and withdrew an envelope, cream-colored, expensive, sealed with his own initials embossed in gold. His hands moved with the same deliberate control that defined everything about him, each gesture measured, purposeful, like a man who had learned long ago that carelessness was a luxury only the living could afford. "Before you make any decisions, you need to understand what this is," he said, his voice deep and solid like an oath. She took the envelope. Inside, her hands trembling like a candle in the wind, was a check for $85,000. The medical debt. All of it. Gone. Beneath the check lay a contract typed on expensive cream paper, and as her eyes moved across the words, she felt something shift inside her chest, a door opening that she'd never dared to approach. Guardian contract. Emma Bianchi. Salary $120,000 annually. Full benefits. Medical coverage. Her own suite on the 3rd floor overlooking the gardens. "You don't have to accept," Aleandro said, and she heard something in his voice that surprised her, vulnerability, carefully controlled but present nonetheless. "But Emma asks for you every single day. She wakes up screaming from nightmares, and the only thing that stops her is your voice." He paused, and in that pause, she understood the weight of what he was offering wasn't money or position. It was trust. "And I?" He stopped. Started again. She'd seen him order the destruction of men's entire lives with less hesitation than he was showing now. "I want you to stay," he finished. Aria looked at the check in her hands, at the contract, at this man who terrified the underworld, who dismantled an entire trafficking network in 48 hours, who'd sent 2 rivals to collect Victoria Ashford from a charity dinner in front of 40 witnesses. Now he stood before her asking, not commanding. Waiting for her answer like a man who understood that some things couldn't be taken, they could only be given. Why? The word came out barely a whisper. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could feel the cold radiating from the windows at her back. Because you pulled me from a burning car when you could have walked away. You didn't know who I was. You didn't know what I could do for you. You just decided someone else's life mattered more than your fear. His hand came up, fingers brushing her cheekbone with a gentleness that made her throat tighten. Because you're the only person Emma trusts besides me. Because the night you called me from that closet, your voice breaking and desperate, I realized you're the bravest person I've ever met. She couldn't breathe. She was waiting for the catch, the price that always came in the darkness, the moment when safety became a cage. His thumb traced her jawline. And because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the moment you grabbed my wrist in the snow. Their kiss tasted like second chances, like redemption that neither of them deserved but both of them needed desperately. She tasted the cold air from the open windows, the faint coffee still lingering on his tongue, and underneath it all, something like promise. A soft sound at the door pulled them apart. Emma stood in the frame, backlit by the hallway light, wearing a nightgown decorated with small embroidered stars. She'd climbed out of bed in Aleandro's suite upstairs, the one with a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon, the one with the door that always stayed unlocked in case she needed to find him in the darkness. Aria stays. The question came out small and uncertain, a 4-year-old testing whether good things were real or just dreams before they evaporated. Aleandro picked up his daughter, lifting her high against his chest, and Emma's thin arms wrapped around his neck. Aria stays, he said, and his daughter's face transformed, the first real smile blooming across her features, a smile that had been stolen 5 years ago and only now returning. Emma reached one small hand toward Aria. Good. Aria signed the contract with a pen that probably cost more than her old monthly rent. Not for the money, though the number on that check represented a freedom she'd never dared imagine. Not for the house or the suite or the escape from invisibility. She signed because sometimes broken people find each other in the dark, and sometimes that's enough to build something new. Sometimes that's everything. But what she didn't expect, couldn't have predicted, was that 6 months later Aleandro would take her to the same diner booth where everything changed, at 3:22 in the morning, and slide a platinum ring across the scarred table while Emma watched from the next booth with Gino, clapping her small hands together. The diamond caught the neon light bleeding through the window, red and blue and white, and when he asked the question, Aria said yes before he even finished speaking. The same waitress who'd served them that first terrible night brought champagne that Aleandro had arranged in advance, a detail that made Aria laugh and cry at the same time, this man who commanded empires remembering that she loved the sweetness of champagne more than the bitterness of wine. 1 year later, on Emma's 7th birthday, they returned to the same booth. The November wind pressed against the windows, gentler this time, carrying the promise of winter rather than its threat. Emma sat between them in a dress the color of morning, unwrapping presents that included art supplies and new books and a photograph of the 3 of them that would be framed and hung in her bedroom at the house overlooking the city. "Mama, tell them about the prayer card," Emma said, pointing to the small laminated card propped against her water glass. Saint Anthony, his gentle face surrounded by rays of gold, the patron saint of lost things found. Aria picked up the card, and for a moment she was 17 again, standing outside St. Catherine's shelter on a morning so cold that breathing hurt, this piece of paper pressed into her palm by Sister Mary with the words, "Sometimes what we've lost comes back to us in unexpected forms. But you have to be brave enough to reach out." She'd carried that card through every shift, every rationed meal, every night in a converted closet with $34 to her name and a debt that felt like a life sentence. That night in the snow, with Aleandro's blood spreading across her hands and his pulse weak beneath her fingers, she'd held the card like a prayer. "This belonged to my mother," Aria said, though it wasn't entirely true, the card belonged to Hope, and Hope had been the only inheritance worth passing down. "And it saved my life. Not because of the saint or the words, but because every time I looked at it, I remembered that lost things can be found. That the people we think we've lost forever sometimes come back in forms we never expected. Aleandro's hand found hers under the table, his wedding band catching the warm light. Marco and Gino sat 3 booths away, keeping watch because old habits never truly died, but their eyes were soft with something like contentment, because their boss had found something worth protecting that wasn't an empire at all. Emma bit into her birthday pancakes, syrup running down her chin, and she asked the question that made Aria's heart nearly break open, "Will you always stay?" "Every single day," Aria whispered, "for the rest of my life." Outside, the snow began to fall again, but it was different this time, clean, gentle, beautiful rather than threatening. The city lights reflected off the white flakes, and through the diner window, San Francisco looked like a place where lost people could actually be found. Aria looked at her reflection in the glass, not invisible anymore, not desperate, not alone. The converted closet and the $34 and the medical debt felt like someone else's life. But she remembered every moment of it. She would always remember. Because sometimes one hand reached out at the right moment can change an entire life. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something in your heart, drop a like right now and subscribe because tomorrow we have another story that will hit you just as hard. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who feels invisible, someone who needs to know that they matter. Comment below and tell us, have you ever helped someone without knowing it would change everything? Have you ever been the unexpected person who saved a life? Tell us your story in the comments. And remember this, always, you are never as invisible as you think you are. Sometimes you're exactly where you need to be to save someone's life, including your own. Sometimes one moment of courage is all it takes. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We wish you good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. After the rain, the sky always clears. We will see you again in the next video.